I want to thank Maggie, who I've been in coordination with in order to be here today, and also my team at the New York City Commission on Human Rights. I'm no stranger to the society. Actually, a couple of months ago now, I actually was at the Riverdale Yonkers branch of the society, speaking about the City Human Rights Commission and the City Human Rights Law and the work that we do. So I want to just thank the New York Society for Ethical Culture for having me today, for having a representative of the administration, the city administration, and the New York City Commission on Human Rights. Once again, my name is Frank Joseph, and I'm Assistant Commissioner at that agency. Yes? To raise the platform. I don't see it. I do not know how to raise the platform. Ah, this is really cool. I appreciate that. Thank you. That's fancy. I want today to be interactive. And so the agency and the work that we do, you can feel free, if you have questions about any particular thing that I say, you can feel free to raise your hand to ask a question, or you can just listen to me and wait till I'm done to ask questions. But I really want this to be an engagement versus more than a lecture, you know, and so to me that's very important. So a little bit about the City Commission on Human Rights. The New York City Commission on Human Rights is a city agency. It is actually a law enforcement agency, and we uphold the city human rights law. So it's a civil law enforcement agency versus a criminal law enforcement agency. And the city human rights law is actually part of the city's charter. It is actually Title 8 and part of the administrative code of New York City. We have over 60 city agencies. Some city agencies were birthed out of initiatives that a mayor or the city council said was appropriate for the city. For us, we're weaved into the very fabric of who the city is. And I think it's very important to say that as we think about who are we as New Yorkers and how do we set the stage for the rest of the nation and how we treat each other. And so for us, the city human rights law is an anti-discrimination civil rights law. Such law when you compare it to any other state or city agency that has a human rights, or civil rights law that they combat. And the reason I say that is because we have 27 what we call protected categories, and protected categories for us are ways that people identify themselves. So whether that's your age, your race, your nation of origin, your gender identity, your sexual orientation, and a slew of other protected categories. And as we're doing this work, there are three main places that we look to when we do this work. The first place is in housing, the second is in employment, and the third is what we call public accommodations. So for example, in housing, let's say that you are a person who is a veteran, and through the GI Bill, you have a voucher that you're able to pay for your housing. And you find an apartment, the voucher pays the rent for that apartment. But unfortunately, the landlord or the management company says, sorry, we don't take vouchers here. Or maybe you have FEPS or SEPS or Section 8, any other voucher that the government provides, what we consider a lawful source of income. Lawful source of income is a protected category under the City Human Rights Commission, meaning that so long as the voucher can pay the entire rent, a landlord cannot deny you the housing if there is one available. And sometimes landlords will do something where they'll say, oh yeah, we have an apartment available, you go, you see it, you come back, you tell them how you're gonna pay, you tell them it's because of a voucher, and they're like, oh man, it just got, someone just took it. I thought you said there were 3 available. Someone took the other 2 as well, right? And it's because they don't want the voucher. And for us, we're saying that that is unlawful. Another thing that sometimes landlords and management companies will do is they'll say, we want someone who makes 60 times the rent. Well, if you have a voucher, you don't need to show that you make 60 times the rent because your voucher covers the rent month to month. And so it's very important for people to know that. In employment, one of some protected categories that we have in employment recently, I'll share this, that passed or was enacted maybe 2 months ago, is reproductive health choices. So now your employer cannot choose to hire, fire, promote, or not promote you, assign you a certain assignment, or not assign you a certain assignment based on your reproductive health choices, or based on, your pregnancy status. Or let's say that you are a person who needs to pump, or you're a person who needs to pump, we have a policy that we rolled out earlier this year on lactation. Actually, in July, we had an event where we were talking about breastfeeding and pregnancy and best practices for employers to make sure that they are accommodating people who need, to pump. And so for us, this is very important because we know oftentimes these are practices that impact women more than anyone else, because women tend to make less on the dollar than their men counterparts. Women also sometimes are not able to receive promotions because you're up for a promotion, but your employer knows that in 2 months you're going to go on maternity leave. You're going to go on maternity leave for 6 months. To them, that's 6 months where you will not be working. And so they decide to not promote you. When you're next up for that promotion, we believe that that is unlawful, that is an unfair practice, and it is discriminatory. Another law that was passed, thank you to former public advocate Tish James, who is now the New York State Attorney General, is salary history. There was a point in time when during an interview, your employer would sit, or a potential employer would sit across from you and would say, how much did you make before? And let's say this is a job that you're applying for that makes, where they're gonna pay someone $90,000, but you used to make $50,000. The potential employer can say, well, if I just give you 70, you'll be happy because that's $20,000 more than you made before. So it doesn't matter that everybody else who has your line makes $90,000, they get to save $20,000 because you only made 50 before. Well, we know that this impacts communities of color the most and also women the most. And so now, salary history, it is forbidden to ask about a person's salary history or to look for someone's salary history when making employment decisions. Because when you are hiring someone, you should be hiring them based on their qualifications, based on their competency, and whatever anyone is making at that position, everyone should be making the same. Of course, if there are things like, because you've been in the workplace for a certain amount of time and sometimes there are certain percentages of increase, that's different versus the base salary. Yes, you had a question.
Is this a New York City?
New York City law, yes. It's New York. Everything I'm going to talk about is New York City. Now, there may be similar laws in the state, but as I'm speaking, I'm going to be talking about what we do here in New York City in the 5 boroughs, the five counties of New York City. And so no longer can an employer look at a person's salary history because we want to level the playing field. When we start talking about public accommodations, you're talking about anywhere where a service or good is being provided. So taxi cab, Uber, Lyft, your restaurant, the park is also considered a public accommodation. So let's say that I am a person with a disability, and because of the way that the seating at a restaurant is set up, I'm not able to comfortably sit, or I can't pass through, the corridor because of the way the restaurant is set up. I have the right to make a request to the service provider, the restaurant, and ask them to please rearrange things so that I can sit and eat just like everybody else who wants to come into this establishment and wants to sit and eat as well. And so that's something that we do. Or let's say you go to the park and you realize that, and as a city, we are working very hard to make sure that all our parks are accessible. But let's say you go into a park and you realize that as you're going to the station room, the restroom, that there's a little lift, right? There's a little ledge, but there's no ramp to get there. If I'm a person with a disability and let's say that I'm in a wheelchair, for example, how do I get up there? Now someone has to assist me to get up. And that's very nice if someone is kind enough to assist me, but I should be able to get into that restroom without that assistance. And so we need to make sure that our parks are more accessible, that our banks are more accessible. And we have a team called the Project Equal Access team that goes around, and we call them the P team for short. And they go around and they assess places all across the city, making sure that it's accessible. And we work very closely with the mayor's office for people with disabilities. So if you know of a place, an establishment or maybe even a housing provider who's not willing to put up a grab bar, or they're saying that the elevator is going to be down for a few months and there's no lift to help people who are not able to go up the stairs when the elevator is going to be down for a few months, you can contact our office and we'll coordinate. And the reason it's beautiful when we say we'll coordinate is, once again, we're a law enforcement agency. So most of our staff are attorneys, and we litigate these cases when there's discrimination, right? We have 2 main bureaus within the the Commission on Human Rights. The first bureau is our Law Enforcement Bureau, where most of our attorneys are housed. So if a person does have a case, they can come to us. They can tell us what the potential act of discrimination was. We'll sit. We begin to investigate. We also have testers. So let's say you went to a restaurant and you're saying that someone made a comment because of your gender or your perceived gender. A waiter or a waitress, one of the staff at the restaurant, they make a rude comment that's discriminatory. We can go and we can test. We can find out, tell us the day, tell us the time, we'll figure out the shift. We will go and we will recreate that scenario to the best of our ability. And we'll go out and test. We've done this in housing a bunch of times, particularly when people will say, oh, you have children? Sorry, we don't allow families with children here. We will go and we will have a potential tenant come in who says that they have no children, and another tenant come in who says that they do have children, and see what the reaction of that landlord or the building management is. And if they do something discriminatory, we consider that a positive test. Positive because now we know that there is discrimination there and we can move forward with litigation through that. The litigation process, once we do everything, it goes through OATH, which is the Office of Administrative Trials and Hearings. It's basically the city's court system. And the judge at OATH makes a recommendation, brings it back to the commission, and eventually our chair, Commissioner Malalis, she ultimately decides what any civil penalties or fines may be. Now, when we start talking about civil penalties and fines, people can face upwards of $250,000 of civil penalties and fines. And then, depending on the nature of the case, there can be emotional distress, there can be back pay. We can tell a housing provider that they do have to provide, a unit to this person because the person is able to pay, and whatever that, maybe they were looking at their nation of origin or their age or their race, they can't, use that to make a determination on if a person can live there or not. You have to do it based on, just blanket qualifications that you're looking at in housing, but not protected categories. And so we do a bunch of this work. Then we have my team, the Community Relations Bureau, which we educate New Yorkers on the city human rights law. We have a bunch of curricula out there. So we have the human rights law, we have working with transgender and gender nonconforming individuals. We have the Fair Chance Act. The Fair Chance Act was something that was passed on November of 2015, which prohibits employers from looking at a person's potential criminal history when making employment decisions. Prior to a conditional offer, you could only look at a person's background. You could only conduct background checks, generally speaking, once a conditional job offer is made. And let's say a person does have an arrest or conviction record, then what you can do, if you believe warning and decided to call the cops, and now the cops arrested this person gets fingerprinted, the judge says you have to do community service. The fact of the matter is, once you're fingerprinted in New York State, that's it. I know people talk about records being sealed. That is a myth, not in New York State. Your records can always be found. The only way your record can disappear is through something called expungement. And there is no such thing as expungement in New York State. However, states like, let's say Texas, for example, has expungement. So that same kid who, if they stole a bag of chips in Texas and did the community service, 10 years later says, I need this removed. It was a bag of chips. It was a minor offense. It was something that most people would say probably shouldn't have caused a person to have a record. A judge can decide to expunge it and act like it never happened. But in New York State, even when you seal the record is still there for people to see, right? It's just a tougher process to get the record, but an employer can still get that record. So let's say in this same case of the 17-year-old who stole the bag of chips, now this person is 27 or this person is 35, and they're applying to work at a daycare center, right? They want to be an instructor at a daycare center. Now you're going to look at their arrest and conviction record that happened 10 or 15 years ago and say that because they stole this bag of chips and they had nothing else, no other record, this person can't be employed. I know I see a lot of people shaking their heads, but these are the cases that have happened every single day prior to November 2015. And this, we were able to pass the Fair Chance Act prior to President Barack Obama even passing the Ban the Box executive order, which does the same thing across the nation. I'm not sure if that still stands because each president can rescind executive orders if they choose to, and we do have a new president. So, but here in New York City, if a person has that, it is unlawful for an employer to ask about it during an interview or on a job application. Other curricula that we have Empowering Young Women, which is a 5-session course. We go into the schools and we speak to, to students, and we talk about empowering young women. We have Race and Color, generally speaking, and then we also have Race and Color for Youth, which is a 3-session course. Another, programming that we have for youth is also discrimination on the basis of gender identity, and sexual orientation. When we start talking about these things with the youth and take a deep dive. We also have peer mediation, which is an 8-week course where we sit with students and we show them that when you and a person don't get along, or when someone is different from you, this is the way that you interact. This is how you resolve conflict, instead of bullying people or deciding to use slurs, or being discriminatory. Because we all think it's important to really start when a person is young to help them understand what's right and what's wrong, especially when we start talking about discrimination. My bureau also puts together different events and programming as well, where we'll partner with community-based organizations. So for example, during the holy month of Ramadan, for those who observe, the Muslim community, as they're fasting, they also, when they break their fast, it's something called an iftar. So what we decided to do, especially because now we see a lot of, unfortunately, anti-Muslim rhetoric being spewed, we decided to do an iftar in the city. Whereas New York City, we are breaking bread with the Muslim community. Whether you are Muslim or you are not Muslim, come, find out, and break bread. That's it, right? We're eating. We also have an interfaith Seder where we do something similar with the Jewish community during the time of Passover. We also have other programming that we do that may be based on immigration status, where in a couple of weeks we'll be having an African diaspora town hall speaking to Africans, African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, and Afro-Latinx communities about what it means to be part of the African diaspora. We also will put an event together for Women's History Month. So start talking about, gender-based harassment and how to combat those things and other issues that women tend to unfortunately deal with. And so we put together these types of programming because we think it's really important to bring people together to foster intergroup relations, which is what my team is charged to do, foster intergroup relations. Another thing that's under our purview at the Community Relations Bureau is we have a bias response team, which we relaunched, because we know that leading up to November 8th, 2016, there was a lot of hateful rhetoric nationwide, and unfortunately also here in the city. So we saw an increase in hate crimes, and we also saw an increase in bias incidents. So the bias response team was something that we had in the late 80s and early 90s during the Crown Heights riots. And for those of you who are familiar with it, there was unfortunately there was turmoil between the Jewish communities and black communities in Crown Heights, Brooklyn. And I mean, it was really terrible. Our agency was actually there at the forefront, really fostering intergroup relations and working with these two communities to say, like, here are two marginalized communities. Instead of tearing each other down, we need to be building each other up. Or take in the 1970s in the community that I'm from, Rosedale, Queens, when at the time it was a predominantly Caucasian community, and when African American communities started moving in, unfortunately not everyone was receptive to that. And so some people started bombing the homes. Right, and there's actually a documentary on this that you can see. You can just Google Rosedale documentary, and it'll come up. It's about an hour of your time, and I promise you it's very educational. And they were bombing the homes. The Commission on Human Rights stepped forward and did something about this. And so throughout the history of our city, we see the Commission on Human Rights stepping in whenever these issues occur. Even as recently as last year, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the nail salon incident in East Flatbush, Brooklyn, where you had a nail salon that was owned by an Asian American person, and the employees were predominantly Asian American, and there was an African American family that they were doing their nails and weren't satisfied with the service, went to complain to the owner. Not sure what happened during that back and forth, but all of a sudden, one of the employees comes and starts hitting the family with the broom and throwing things on them. So this caused a lot of tension between the Asian American and African American communities in Brooklyn. And if you look at the history of our city, because I think as we're addressing issues, it's important to know the history of these. In the 90s, there was a lot of turmoil between black communities and Asian American communities as well. So we saw this and we said, we don't need a repeat of the 90s. So the commission stepped right in. We started talking to Asian American community leaders across the city, started talking to African American community leaders across the city and said, how do we bring people together? We were able to have both communities put out a letter that spoke about discrimination, that spoke about racial justice, and really spoke from the eyes of each other and the need to come together. And so this was very important for us because you had some salons that were saying they will no longer take a particular type of client. You had African American communities saying that they'll no longer go to nail salons owned by a particular group of people. We didn't think that this was representative of our city. And so we wanted to do something about that. And we were able to mend that, we were able to fix that situation and really bring groups together. And so really important. Or even during the Kavanaugh hearings that were taking place, because under our law, we also have an act that was passed by the New York City Council called the Stop Sexual Harassment in the Workplace Act. What we do is whenever there's gender-based harassment, it's something that we can step in on in the workplace. It's a place where we step in and we also have jurisdiction. And during the Kavanaugh hearings, even though whatever happened with Kavanaugh, the allegations are not anything that is jurisdictional to us because, we're the city human rights law, New York City Human Rights Commission, we knew what that could stir up with people who were in New York City. Because even when something is not happening in New York City, for example, when you see the Muslim ban, or when you see what's happening, what was happening in the South at the border, our agency speaks up because we know that women who are survivors of domestic violence, it's a re-traumatization when you're seeing someone who is alleged to have done such acts there and speaking and acting like it didn't happen. And so we wanted to do something about it, so we partnered with some community-based organizations and had a major rally on the steps of City Hall where the First Lady of New York City, Chirlane McCray, was able to speak. And we were able to just get a bunch of different organizations, Girls for Gender Justice, the YWCA, agencies and organizations across this city really coming out and standing with women and those who identify as women, letting them know if there are issues, the city's here for them, and here are also some community-based organizations that are here for them as well. Yes?
You spoke about the incident in the nail salon. What about the human trafficking that was said to be going on in the nail salon?
The human trafficking that's going on, that was alleged to be going on in the nail salon? Well, just going to be as honest with you as possible, we have to look at, when we're looking at things, we have to look at things based on what's jurisdictional to us. And so something like that is not something that's necessarily jurisdictional to us. Human trafficking is a criminal offense, and so that's something that we will coordinate with NYPD, and they would be the lead agency on. But we wouldn't be able to be the lead agency on that. A perfect example, I'm sure everyone knows about what happened on Staten Island a few years ago with Eric Garner, and a bunch of people were coming to our agency saying, hey, another thing that's under our purview is bias-based profiling by law enforcement. So if you are being stopped by law enforcement and you believe it's because of your gender and they're harassing you, or because of your race and they're harassing your age, we can step in those places. We're strengthening that part of our work, but we can step in those places. However, something like this was outside of our purview. And also as a law enforcement agency, because it was something that was being investigated, because it was something that was going to be ruled on, as a law enforcement agency, if we speak out publicly, what we do is we mess up due process. And so all law enforcement agencies have to be very careful when certain incidents occur, and that's why sometimes people will say, why don't you speak out right now? Well, if there's ongoing investigation in case, because of due process, you will likely, not always, but you will likely not hear from us because we're letting due process take precedent. And then from there, we might be working on things in the background to see, hey, if this doesn't go the way that we believe it should go, what can we do here, if anything? But in the human trafficking case, the allegations of those is something that NYPD would take the lead on. Thank you for raising that. Yes, Amy. Oh yes, we work with ACLU. We work with NYCLU all the time. Actually, a lot of my staff come from ACLU or come from NYCLU, so we're always working with them, and we always tell them, if you have any good people that you think could be coming to the city side to continue this great work, please let us know. And sometimes our people go over to ACLU and NYCLU as well. But yes, definitely, we definitely do. And so This bias response work that we're doing is really important, unfortunately we see, just looking at this past fiscal year, we saw an increase of over 140% when we're talking about bias incidents. And so we work very closely with NYPD to track hate crimes, to track bias incidents. You'll hear me say bias incidents a lot because something discriminatory could occur, but it may not rise to the level of a hate crime because the threshold is so high for something to be considered a hate crime. So NYPD does work in tandem with us and sometimes sends us matters that they say, hey, it's not considered a hate crime, but you may want to take a look at this. Yes?
I'm curious about when you get to have human rights. I'll tell you the background I'm expressing.
Yes, please do.
From the perspective of pediatrics and children with parents, or sometimes without parents. The human rights apply to those under 18, or is that in a different bit?
Human rights applies to everyone. People under 18, let's say for example, I'll give you a scenario. In the Bronx, I think a year or two ago, there was a student who identified with the LGBTQ community, was being bullied all the time. Unfortunately, all of it being piled up, they came into the school with a weapon and they shot 2 kids, right? And so in a situation like that where there's a lot of different moving parts, we had to look at the entire scenario. We had to look at a person's human rights being violated from the onset, and then we also had to look at the fact that now there's a criminal element, right? And work with PD and also work with the Department of Education on how we mitigate the situation. We can step in those situations, but because someone is a minor and they're under 18, we would need to at some point work with a guardian when it comes to a case. We do not want to take, we will not take cases with just minors on them without a guardian signing that off. And sometimes it's just for multiple reasons, particularly if it happened in the context of school, because oftentimes that student has to go back into that school. So what are other ways that we can work with young people? But yes, we do that. And that's why we have a lot of youth programming as well, because that is an area of our work that we want to make sure that people know. We will work with young people as well who are facing discrimination, whose human rights are being violated. No problem. And so other parts of our agency really quickly, we also have the Office of the Chair where our policy team is housed. We're working on different initiatives. So some of you may have seen recently New York State passed what they call the Crown Act, where based on a person's hairstyle or hair texture, they can't be discriminated against. Believe it or not, there were some employers who used to tell people that, hey, if you wear Bantu knots, right? Or if you color your hair, or if you have a protected style, that you can't come to the workplace that way. And unfortunately, those hairstyles tend to be associated with communities of color. So we consider that banning of certain hairstyles and that whole gambit of issues, we consider that to be a form of racial discrimination. We put this, this policy out, this guidance out early in the year, and as soon as we put it out, every media outlet across the world picked it up. I'm not just the New York Times and the Washington Post, not just the Roots. We're talking about, you know, in Europe, in Asia, everywhere, media outlets are talking about this for a city, for a government entity to classify this as racial discrimination. Then, about 2 months later, California passes the Crown Act, because California always tries to do things before us. And then New York State passed the Crown Act, which now, because when you put out a guidance, you're saying, we consider this to be unlawful, but here are best practices, but then it has to go into rulemaking in order for it to actually be a law that you can enforce more strongly. And so in New York State, the Crown Act has been passed because of the city's guidance that was put out, and we consider that a form of racial discrimination. We do a lot of different campaigns as well that come out of the Office of the Chair and my team. So last year we did a campaign on sexual harassment. You may have seen it on the subways or bus stops where it says, it was just a joke, or, you know, it was just words. And we cross out words and we cross out joke and it says, no, it's sexual harassment. Or you might see some of our literature that says proud, strong, bold. Really taking words that are positive, that are strong, and associating them with the LGBTQ community, because oftentimes people would not associate these positive words with the LGBTQ community. So we wanted to change the narrative of how people saw members of the LGBTQ community. Or earlier this year, we had a campaign called While Black, where it said renting while black is a human right, walking while black is a human right, shopping while black is a human right. So we're constantly working on these campaigns to make sure that people know that We hear you, we see you, and we're working with you. So it doesn't matter who you are, where you're from, the Commission on Human Rights is here to uphold your rights and to work closely with you. We also have an Office of Mediation and Conflict Resolution. Sometimes people don't want to go through litigation, sometimes they just want an apology. If both parties agree to mediate, we have a team that can work on mediation and what that looks like. The Commission on Human Rights are, yes, go ahead.
Do you do any training in implicit bias?
We personally don't do training in implicit bias, but we do partner with community-based organizations who do. And the reason that we don't do trainings in implicit bias is because what we will do, our curricula that talks about the human rights law in different areas and different protected categories have elements of implicit bias and helps. They are culturally competent. They're not just talking about the law. So when we're talking about racism and colorism, we're going to tell you about the history of racism and colorism, even here in New York City, how slaves were being sold on Wall Street, and that's why it's called Wall Street, and that's why it's called Front Street. Or we'll talk about in our what we call Trans 101, working with transgender and gender nonconforming individuals. In that training, we'll start talking about different terminology that was associated with the transgender communities that actually are very hurtful. So when people say FAGGOT, how that is a hurtful word, or how LGBTQ communities oftentimes, when they say this word, but oftentimes don't like when people who are not part of the community to use the word queer, right? And sometimes some of these things are generational as well. Over time, people will say, we're reclaiming this word, we don't want anyone to use it. So we have cultural competency elements to it. We don't necessarily do implicit bias at the forefront. The reason we partner with community-based organizations, CBOs, is because as government, we don't want to take people's space. If there are organizations that are doing bystander intervention training, implicit bias training, they get funding to do this work. If the government swoops in and does it, we're removing work that communities are doing, and oftentimes it's marginalized communities leading the front on these efforts. So we don't do that because we want to partner with CBO. So if you all are interested in something like implicit bias training, we can partner up where someone from my staff can come, do some training about a specific area of our work, and we have a CBO that comes in and will do the implicit bias part of the training. So yes.
Unfortunately, a lot of what I've seen in terms of education around disabilities is centered around very visible kinds of physical problems.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about people in wheelchairs, people with crutches, and so on. Do you have any kinds of education that you do around, say, for instance, autism spectrum conditions?
Yes, we talk about those. We also do programming about them. Actually, in June, we had an event called, I don't remember the full name of the event, to be honest with you, but basically we were focusing on invisible disabilities, because just what you said, people, when folks think about disabilities, they think about what they can see. But oftentimes there are people with disabilities and you cannot see what it is that they may have or what they're going through. And so we do that work. We have a workshop that is called Equal Access, working with people with disabilities in New York City, and we talk about that as well. So if that's something that you're interested in, I can have my P team, my Project Equal Access team, be in touch with you, and we could coordinate something as well in regards to that. I want to tell you really quickly about history about the Commission on Human Rights. 1944, Fiorella LaGuardia, the mayor of New York City, sees a lot of tension in New York City and says, we need a committee on unity. We need a group of people who are going to come together and are going to look at folks across the city, no matter who they are, and say, how can we unify? That Committee on Unity then became the Commission on Unity. Then under Robert F. Wagner, Mayor Robert F. Wagner, I believe it's 1955, he says this will be a full-fledged agency. It will be part of the administrative code of the city, and it will be called the New York City Commission on Human Rights. And so since 1955, we've been the Commission on Human Rights. But it started because of Mayor LaGuardia, who just wanted to unify New Yorkers. And so for us, when we're doing our work, that's really what we're doing. We want to unify New Yorkers. We want to make sure that people are not treated less well because of who they are and how they identify. We want to make sure that we can foster intergroup relations, that just because you and I may be different, or we have perceived differences, because our law isn't just for because of someone's nation of origin or immigration status, but you might discriminate against me just because of my perceived age or because of my perceived, disability status. And that's under our law as well. So we want to unify people and foster intergroup relations because of that. And it's very important for us to do that type of work. And so if we could ever partner with you all here, we are here. And that's why I think working with, the New York Society for Ethical Culture is really important, because the spirit behind the society is one where we do not treat people less well because of who they are. We respect everyone, despite any of differences. Actually, because of the differences, because we want to get to know more about you and create this ethical culture. And I think the spirit behind, the society and the spirit and law behind my agency is one that is a perfect match. And I really look forward to working with you all in the future and moving forward. Yes.
What work, if any, are you doing around the immigration crisis?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. It's particularly around the border. So we did something very brave that normally government would not do, particularly a city agency. There's an organization called IORA. It's the International Organization of Official Human Rights Agencies across the world. We told them, in this unprecedented time, when we see what's happening when it comes to immigration, particularly what was happening at the border, IORA needs to step up and put out a statement. They said, we've never done this before. And we said, we know, but it's time to do it. And so we led an effort where we had human rights agencies across the United States, whether they were in Austin, Texas, or whether they're city human rights agencies or state human rights agencies. Austin, Texas, Illinois, Cook County, San Francisco, LA, New York City, and New York State, working with IORA. We put out a video. I don't know if you've ever seen the CW Dare to Defy video when they're all reading the same script but different people are saying different portions. We put out that video condemning what's happening at the border, and then we got people to sign. Now we're also working with organizations such as Sanctuary Coalition, because they have people who are going to the borders, who are helping folks. And so as an agency, we cannot legally, in our agency capacity, do that, but we're making a way for folks who wish to volunteer to have that easy access. Now, what we're doing in New York City, we want people who, are immigrants, who have family members or friends who are immigrants to know about their protections, to know that New York City will not cooperate with any federal agency that's trying to remove people. Will not cooperate with ICE. We want people to also know that if your landlord threatens you and says, hey, you better shut up about the repairs or else I'll call ICE on you, that guess what? We will come in and we will litigate that case. And I don't just say it to say it, I say it because in Jackson Heights, Queens, that did happen, where a housing provider threatened somebody by saying, I'll call ICE on you if you keep complaining about the repairs that you want. And so we came in and litigated that. So we'll do things on the city level because we know that whatever's happening nationwide, some people will use that to their advantage and will begin to spew that hateful rhetoric because of the power and privilege that they may have, because they're a landlord and a tenant needs housing. I know you have a follow-up question.
Yeah.
And I see you as well.
That's great to hear that. But and this might not fall under your review, but I've seen videos, and maybe some people here are also on social media, of how ICE officers break the law, actually.
Yeah.
They come into a private house or a private space,
Yeah.
and they can do that. If that falls under your purview, if that happens, because there's ICE officers here.
Yeah. So because we're a city agency, we do not have jurisdiction over state and federal agencies. What we can do is, let's say someone did cooperate with ICE, particularly if it was like a city agency is perceived to cooperate with ICE, which has never happened, but it's hypothetical. We can investigate it and then we can litigate those matters. So if we find out someone was coordinating with ICE because they wanted to, invoke harm upon someone because of their immigration status or perceived immigration status, that's an area where we can come in. But as far as ICE itself, as a city agency, we do not have jurisdiction over them. Yes.
For those who are concerned with, who would like to be help folks with immigrants in New York who go to court, I urge you to watch for the September issue of ALA, because there will be a workshop here.
Oh, amazing.
Supporting immigrants.
That's amazing. That's really great. So yeah, that's a little bit of, yes, you and then Amy.
Does your agency take volunteers?
Yes, if anyone would like to volunteer, please, I will give my card. Maggie also has my contact information. Please reach out to us. We always want volunteers. Yes, Amy? Yeah, we have some literature in the back table, where the blue tablecloth is, and so please, it gives you all some resources about my agency. It tells you about all the other protected classes and protected categories, because there are a slew of them, 27 as I said, and counting, because we're always amending the law, and it lets you know how to contact us if anyone ever faces discrimination. For us, my commissioner always says we are the non-government government agency, and what that means is we don't want to function like every agency where you can't be in touch with somebody. We want you right away. You need to speak to someone, don't call 311, we'll give you our line, right? You'll call 311, you'll get a number, you'll wait 3 weeks. We want you to call us, and within 48 working hours, we will get back in touch with you. Whenever I speak somewhere, I give people my direct contact information, because that way, if someone from my team is not responsive to you, then I will definitely hold their feet to the fire to make sure that we are doing our job and making sure that we're serving all New Yorkers no matter what. Thank you very much for listening, for your time. Look forward to working with you all.